"Did you enjoy the monthly payments, Mom?" my son asked, smiling as if he had just reminded me of something pleasant, something obvious, something I should have been grateful for. And I remember the exact way my hand froze midair, the fork hovering just above my plate, because in that quiet, ordinary moment, something inside me shifted in a way I couldn't quite explain yet, something subtle but deeply unsettling, like a picture frame hanging just slightly crooked on a wall you've walked past 1,000 times without noticing until suddenly you can't look away from it. And I looked up at him, at Daniel, my only son, the boy I had raised on scraped knees and bedtime stories and Sunday pancakes, now sitting across from me in a pressed shirt that probably cost more than my entire monthly grocery budget. And I said the only thing that made sense in that moment, the only honest answer I had: "What payments?" And the silence that followed wasn't loud or dramatic. It didn't shatter the room or send anyone storming out, but it stretched thin and tight between us like a thread pulled too far. And I noticed then the way Rebecca, my daughter-in-law, who had been quietly sipping her wine just seconds before, went completely still, her glass paused halfway to her lips, her eyes flickering not toward me but toward Daniel, just for a fraction of a second, and it was such a small thing, so easy to miss, the kind of detail you would forget almost instantly if you weren't paying attention. But something about it stayed with me, lodged itself somewhere deep in my mind, and Daniel let out a small laugh, the kind that sounds rehearsed even when it isn't, and said, "The transfers, Mom, the monthly support I've been sending you for the past 2 years. And I remember blinking once, then twice, as if that might somehow rearrange the words into something more familiar, something that made sense, but they didn't change, they just sat there between us, heavy and unmoving, and I felt an odd sensation in my chest, not quite panic, not quite confusion, but something quieter, colder, like the beginning of a realization that hadn't fully formed yet. And I set my fork down carefully, aligning it with the edge of the plate the way I always did, because habits have a way of grounding you when your thoughts start drifting somewhere uncertain. And I said as calmly as I could, "Daniel, I haven't received any transfers." And this time the silence was different. This time it wasn't stretched thin, it was dense, almost tangible, pressing in from all sides. And I watched as the color in his face shifted ever so slightly, his smile faltering at the edges, while Rebecca finally lowered her glass, placing it gently on the table as if sudden movements might draw attention she didn't want. And for a moment no one spoke, no one moved, and I became aware of the smallest details, the faint hum of the refrigerator in the background, the ticking of the clock above the doorway, the way the late afternoon light filtered through the curtains and cast soft shadows across the table. And it all felt too still, too composed, like a scene that had been carefully arranged, and I realized then that I was looking at something I didn't fully understand yet, something that didn't match the version of reality I had been living in. And I felt the first flicker of doubt, not loud or overwhelming but quiet and persistent, like a whisper you can't quite make out but can't ignore either. And Daniel was already reaching for his phone, his fingers moving quickly across the screen, his expression tightening as he scrolled, as if the answers he expected to find there weren't lining up the way they should. And Rebecca finally spoke, her voice light, almost too light. "Maybe there's just been some kind of mix-up," she said, offering a small practiced smile that didn't quite reach her eyes, and I nodded because that was the reasonable explanation, the one that made everything neat and simple again, the one that allowed the world to remain exactly as I had believed it to be just minutes earlier. But even as I nodded, even as I allowed that explanation to settle over the table like a thin layer of comfort, something inside me resisted it, something quiet but firm. And later that evening, after they had left, after the dishes had been washed and dried and put away, after the house had returned to its usual stillness, I found myself sitting alone at the kitchen table, staring at a stack of unopened mail, and for the first time in years, I felt an unfamiliar urge, not driven by fear or anger, but by something steadier, more deliberate, a need to look closer, to go back, to review everything carefully, because suddenly, I couldn't shake the feeling that there were details in my life, small, ordinary details, that no longer matched the way I remembered them. I did not sleep much that night, not because of fear, but because something quiet and persistent had begun to take shape in my mind, something that refused to be ignored no matter how many times I told myself there was probably a simple explanation. And by the time the sun came through the kitchen window the next morning, casting that soft golden light across the table where I had spent most of my life drinking coffee and reading the newspaper, I already knew that I was going to start looking, really looking at things I had not questioned in years. And I remember standing there for a long moment, holding my mug in both hands, staring at the neat stack of envelopes I had left untouched the night before, because opening them suddenly felt different now, no longer routine, no longer something you did absent-mindedly between breakfast and the morning news, but something deliberate, something that might actually matter. And I sat down slowly, pulling the stack closer, noticing how many of them were from the bank, from utility companies, from places that had been part of my life for decades, and I realized that I could not remember the last time I had truly read through any of them carefully, not just glanced at the totals, not just confirmed that everything seemed normal, but actually read them line by line, and the thought unsettled me more than I expected because I had always considered myself careful, organized, someone who kept track of things, but now, sitting there in the quiet of my kitchen, I could not shake the feeling that I had been living on assumptions rather than facts, and I opened the first envelope, unfolding the statement with steady hands, my eyes moving across the numbers, the dates, the transactions, and at first everything seemed ordinary, the same small expenses, groceries, electricity, the occasional medical bill, but then I noticed something small, almost insignificant, a line that should have been there but was not, a deposit that never appeared, and I paused, frowning slightly, telling myself I might have remembered it wrong, that perhaps I had misunderstood what Daniel said, but the feeling did not go away, and I opened another statement, then another, moving back through the months, then the years, and with each page that quiet discomfort grew a little stronger, a little harder to dismiss, because it was not just one missing detail, it was a pattern, subtle but consistent, like a story that had been rewritten in small ways over time, and I found myself reaching for an old folder I kept in the cabinet by the refrigerator, the one where I stored older documents, tax papers, things I rarely needed but never threw away, and I flipped through it slowly, carefully, comparing dates, amounts, signatures, and that was when I noticed something that made me stop completely, something that did not just feel off but wrong, a document I did not remember signing, a form with my name written neatly at the bottom, but the signature was not quite right, not exactly how I wrote it, close enough that most people would not question it, but different in a way only I would recognize, and I sat back in my chair, staring at that page, feeling the weight of that realization settle over me, not as a sudden shock, but as a slow, steady understanding that something in my life had been altered without my knowledge, and I thought about Daniel, about the way he had looked at me the night before, the confusion in his voice, and I thought about Rebecca, about that brief moment when her eyes had shifted toward him before I even answered, and for the first time, I allowed myself to consider the possibility that this was not a mistake, not a simple mix-up, but something intentional, something that had been happening quietly, carefully, over a long period of time, and I remember closing the folder gently, placing it back on the table and sitting there in silence, listening to the faint ticking of the clock, realizing that the life I thought I understood, the one I had trusted without question, might not be as solid as I had always believed, and that whatever was hidden beneath those small inconsistencies, those missing details, was something I was going to have to uncover on my own. The next morning I did not rush into anything, I did not call Daniel, I did not confront Rebecca, and I did not allow myself the comfort of easy assumptions, because the more I thought about what I had seen, the more I understood that whatever was happening had been built slowly, carefully, over time, and anything built that way would not reveal itself all at once, so instead I chose to move just as carefully, just as quietly, starting with the one place I knew would not lie to me if I asked the right questions, the bank, and I remember standing in line that afternoon, holding a small folder under my arm, the same one I had filled with copies of statements and documents that no longer made sense, watching the people ahead of me talk and laugh and check their phones, completely unaware that the ground beneath my own life had begun to shift, and when it was my turn, I stepped forward and smiled politely, the way I always did, and asked if someone could help me review my account history in more detail, because I believed there might be a mistake, and the young man behind the counter nodded without hesitation, his expression neutral and professional, as he led me to a small desk near the back where a computer screen glowed softly in the dim light, and I sat down, placing my folder carefully on the surface, my hands steady, my voice calm, even as my thoughts moved with quiet intensity beneath the surface, and he began to pull up my account records, scrolling through months, then years, explaining each section in a tone that suggested he had done this hundreds of times before, but I was not listening to his explanations, not entirely. I was watching the screen, watching the numbers appear and disappear, looking for something that matched what Daniel had said, something that confirmed those monthly payments he believed he had been sending, and for a while there was nothing, just the same modest transactions I had already seen at home, the same pattern of careful spending and small balances, and I could feel that quiet doubt begin to press in again, that small voice suggesting perhaps there really had been a misunderstanding, that perhaps I had misheard or misremembered. But then the young man paused, his hand hovering over the mouse for just a second longer than before, and he leaned slightly closer to the screen, his brow furrowing in a way that told me he had noticed something that did not quite fit, and he clicked into another section, one I had never seen before, something labeled under internal transfers and linked accounts, and suddenly the pattern changed, and I felt it before I fully understood it, that same subtle shift, that same quiet wrongness as a series of transactions appeared not in my account but connected to it, transfers that originated from a source I recognized immediately. Daniel's business account, the amounts consistent, regular, every month for nearly 2 years, exactly as he had said. And I remember the exact moment my breath slowed, not quickened, not panicked, but slowed, as if my body had decided to move more carefully now, to absorb each detail without rushing. Because this was no longer a question of misunderstanding. The payments existed, they had been sent, they were real, and yet they had never reached me. And the young man turned the screen slightly, so I could see more clearly, explaining that the funds had been redirected to a secondary account, one that was authorized under my profile but not actively used for my primary banking. And I felt something settle into place in my mind, something cold and precise, as I asked him, as evenly as I could, who had authorized that secondary account, and he hesitated just briefly before scrolling again, clicking through records, and then he read the name aloud, and I did not react, not outwardly. I did not gasp or question or raise my voice, I simply nodded once, as if confirming something I had already begun to understand, because the name he said was Rebecca Collins, and in that moment everything that had felt like scattered, disconnected details began to align, not into chaos, but into a pattern so clear it was almost quiet in its certainty, and I thanked him, closed my folder, and walked out of the bank into the bright afternoon light, carrying with me not confusion, not doubt, but the beginning of something far more deliberate, because now I was no longer searching for answers, I was beginning to see the shape of the truth. On the drive home I did not turn on the radio, I did not call anyone, and I did not allow myself to fill the silence with distractions, because what I had just learned deserved more than a reaction. It required understanding, and I remember keeping both hands steady on the wheel, my eyes fixed on the road, while my mind began to move through the past with a clarity I had not allowed myself before, replaying moments that once felt ordinary but now seemed slightly out of place, like pieces of a puzzle that had never quite fit together. And I thought about Rebecca, about the way she had always offered to help with things I had managed perfectly well on my own for decades, the way she had insisted on organizing my paperwork after my husband passed, saying it would make things easier for me, and at the time I had been grateful, too tired from grief to question her intentions, too trusting to imagine anything beyond kindness. And I remembered the afternoon she sat at my kitchen table, with a neat stack of forms, her voice calm and reassuring as she pointed to where I needed to sign, explaining that it was just a routine update, just something to simplify my accounts, and I had signed without hesitation because she was family, because Daniel trusted her, because I had never been given a reason not to, and now as those memories returned, they did not feel warm or comforting, they felt precise, calculated, like steps in a process I had not realized I was part of, and I felt no anger in that moment, only a quiet recognition that what had been done to me had not happened all at once. It had been built slowly, through small decisions, small moments of trust, each one seemingly harmless on its own, but together forming something far more significant. And when I pulled into my driveway, I sat in the car for a long moment before getting out, looking at the house that had been mine for over 30 years, the same house where I had raised Daniel, where every room held memories of a life I believed I understood, and I realized that understanding had changed, not because the house was different, but because I was seeing it differently now, noticing things I had overlooked, questioning things I had accepted without thought. And inside, I went straight to the cabinet where I kept the rest of my documents, pulling out every folder, every envelope, every piece of paper that might hold another detail I had missed, and I spread them across the dining table, organizing them carefully, comparing signatures, dates, account numbers, and with each comparison, the pattern became clearer, not chaotic, not confusing, but deliberate, consistent, as if someone had followed a plan with patience and precision. And I found more forms, more authorizations I did not fully remember signing, each one giving access, control, permission, all under the appearance of convenience, of help, of family support. And I noticed how the dates aligned, how each document followed a moment in my life when I had been vulnerable, after my husband's passing, during a brief hospital stay, during a time when I had told Rebecca I felt overwhelmed managing everything alone, and I sat there, surrounded by the evidence of my own trust, feeling something settle inside me, something steady and unshakable, because this was no longer a question of whether something had gone wrong, it was a question of how far it had gone, and how carefully it had been done, and I thought about Daniel again, about the genuine confusion in his voice, about the way he had immediately reached for his phone, searching for answers he believed should have been there, and I understood then that he had not been part of this, not knowingly, which meant that whatever Rebecca had done, she had done quietly, without drawing attention, without creating conflict, and that realization did not bring me comfort, but it gave me clarity because it told me exactly where to focus, and I leaned back in my chair, looking at the documents spread out before me, and for the first time since that dinner, I allowed myself a small, controlled breath, not of relief but of certainty, because I was no longer reacting to something I did not understand, I was observing something I could now see clearly, and I knew that whatever came next would not be driven by emotion or confrontation, but by patience, by precision, and by the same quiet attention to detail that had revealed the truth in the first place. That evening I did not rush to act on what I had found. I did not pick up the phone or send a message or confront anyone, because the more I understood, the more I realized that acting too soon would only give away what I knew, and whatever had been done quietly, carefully, over time, which meant it could only be undone the same way. And I remember sitting at the dining table long after the sun had set, the soft glow of the lamp casting shadows over the documents spread out before me, and I began to think not as someone who had been wronged, but as someone who needed to see the full picture before making a single move. And the first thing I understood was that I could not rely on memory alone anymore, not even my own, because memory could be questioned, dismissed, or even used against me, but documents, records, and timelines could not. And so I reached for a notebook, something simple, something I had used years ago for grocery lists and reminders, and I began to write. Not emotions, not suspicions, but facts, dates, amounts, names, each detail placed carefully on the page as if I were rebuilding a story that had been quietly altered without my knowledge. And as I wrote, patterns that had once been hidden in plain sight began to take shape more clearly, the transfers that had never reached me, the authorizations I did not fully recall, the timing of each document aligning too precisely with moments when I had been vulnerable, and I did not rush through it. I took my time because I understood now that this was not about proving something quickly, it was about understanding it completely, and once I had finished organizing what I already had, I moved to the next step, the one that required a little more care, a little more patience, and the next morning I made a call, not to Daniel, not to Rebecca, but to a number I had not dialed in years, the office of the attorney who had handled my late husband's estate. And when the receptionist answered, her voice polite and professional, I introduced myself calmly, explaining that I needed to review some documents related to my accounts and authorizations, and there was a brief pause before she recognized my name, her tone softening slightly as she offered to schedule an appointment, and I agreed without hesitation, setting a time for later that week, because I knew that whatever I needed to confirm, I would need someone who understood the language of those documents better than I did, someone who could see what I might still miss, and in the days that followed, I did something that might have seemed small from the outside but felt significant to me. I returned to my routine. I went about my day as I always did. I answered Daniel's occasional messages with the same warmth, the same calm tone he was used to. I even agreed to have dinner with them again, and when I saw Rebecca, I did not look at her differently, not in any way that would reveal what I knew, because I understood that the moment she realized I was aware, everything would change, and I was not ready for that yet, not until I had everything in place. And during that dinner, I paid attention, not to what was said, but to what was not said, to the small pauses, the subtle exchanges of glances, the way Rebecca answered certain questions too quickly, the way Daniel trusted her responses without question, and it confirmed what I had already begun to suspect, that whatever had been done with confidence, with the belief that it would never be questioned, and that belief was my advantage now. And later that night, as I sat alone once again in the quiet of my home, I reviewed my notes, my documents, my timeline, and I realized that I was no longer trying to understand what had happened. I already knew what I was doing now was preparing for what would happen next, and for the first time since this began, I felt something steady and controlled settle within me, not anger, not fear, but a quiet certainty that whatever came next would not be rushed, would not be emotional, but would be precise, measured, and impossible to ignore. The day of the appointment arrived with a kind of quiet clarity that I had not felt in a long time, Not because the situation had become easier, but because I had stopped expecting it to be anything other than what it was. And as I walked into the attorney's office, I carried with me not just a folder of documents, but a carefully organized understanding of everything I had seen so far. And when I sat across from Mr. Harrison, a man who had known my family for years and had once helped my husband and me plan what we believed would be a secure and straightforward future, I did not rush into explanations or accusations. I simply placed the documents in front of him and asked if he would help me review them, because there were details that no longer made sense, and he nodded, his expression serious but calm, as he adjusted his glasses and began to read, slowly, thoroughly, the way someone does when they understand that what they are looking at matters. And for a while, the room was filled only with the soft sound of paper shifting, the occasional click of his pen, and I watched him carefully, not interrupting, not guiding his attention, allowing him to see things as they were without influence, because I needed to know what was there, not what I thought might be there. And after several minutes, he leaned back slightly, his expression changing in a way that was subtle but unmistakable, and he asked me a simple question: whether I had knowingly authorized a secondary account holder with full access to my funds. And I answered just as simply that I had signed documents presented to me as routine updates, but I had never intended to give anyone control over my finances. And he nodded again, this time more slowly, as if confirming something he had already begun to suspect. And he explained that the documents I had signed did in fact grant that level of access, not temporarily, not partially, but fully, including the ability to redirect funds, manage transfers, and make financial decisions on my behalf. And I listened without interrupting, because none of this surprised me anymore, not after what I had already seen, but what came next mattered more than the explanation. And I asked him if those permissions could have been used to create the transfer pattern I had discovered, and he did not hesitate. He simply said yes, and in that moment, the last remaining uncertainty faded, not dramatically, not with a sense of shock, but with a quiet finality that settled over everything I had been piecing together. And he continued, explaining that while the actions themselves might have been authorized on paper, the intent behind them could still be questioned, especially if I had been misled about what I was signing, and that there were ways to challenge those actions, to review the transfers, to trace where the funds had gone and how they had been used. And I nodded, not because I was overwhelmed, but because I was already thinking ahead, already considering what would be needed, not just to understand what had happened, but to address it properly. And when the meeting ended, I did not feel shaken, I did not feel uncertain, I felt focused, because I now had confirmation from someone who understood the system far better than I did. And as I stepped outside into the afternoon light, I realized that everything I had uncovered so far had been leading to this point, the moment where suspicion became clarity, where patterns became facts, and where what had been done quietly could no longer remain hidden. And yet, I still did not rush, I did not call Daniel, I did not confront Rebecca, because now more than ever, I understood the importance of timing, of preparation, of allowing those who believed they were in control to remain comfortable just a little longer. And that evening, as I returned home and placed the folder back on my dining table, I made a small adjustment to my notes, adding one simple word at the top of the page, not as a reaction, not as an accusation, but as a quiet acknowledgement of what I now knew. And that word was deliberate, because everything that had happened had been done with intention, and everything I would do next would be as well. From that moment on, I began to move differently, not in a way anyone else would notice, but in a way that changed everything about how I observed the world around me. Because once you understand that something has been carefully hidden, you also understand that revealing what you know too soon only gives the other person time to adjust. And I had no intention of giving that advantage away, so instead I chose something far more useful. I chose patience, and over the next several days I allowed everything to appear exactly as it always had. I answered Daniel's messages with the same warmth, I agreed to another dinner without hesitation, and when I saw Rebecca, I greeted her the same way I always did, with a calm smile and steady eyes, because I knew that any shift in my behavior, no matter how small, could alert her to the fact that something had changed, and I needed her to believe that nothing had, and that was not difficult. Not really, because for years I had been the one who kept things smooth, who avoided conflict, who made sure everyone felt comfortable. And now I simply used that same skill in a different way, not to protect peace but to protect my understanding. And during those dinners I listened more than I spoke. I paid attention to the rhythm of their conversations, to the way Rebecca answered questions about finances or plans for the future, to the way Daniel accepted her answers without hesitation, trusting her in a way that once would have reassured me. But now only confirmed what I already knew, and there were moments, small ones, when I could see it more clearly than ever, the confidence in her tone, the ease with which she spoke about things that were not entirely hers to manage, and it told me that she believed her position was secure, that she believed the structure she had built could not be questioned, and that belief was exactly what allowed me to continue observing without interference. And in between those meetings, I continued my own quiet work, organizing every document, every transaction, every authorization into something clear and undeniable, not just for myself but for anyone who would need to see it, because I understood that when the time came, clarity would matter more than emotion, and facts would carry more weight than any explanation. And I did not rush that process. I took the time to make sure that everything aligned, that every date matched, that every signature, every transfer, every account connection told the same story. And as I did, something else began to take shape, not just understanding, but strategy, because it was no longer enough to know what had happened. I needed to decide how it would end, and that required more than evidence, it required timing. And so I made a decision that might have seemed unusual to anyone watching from the outside, but felt entirely logical to me. I began to allow small signs of forgetfulness to appear, not dramatically, not in a way that would raise concern, but in subtle ways, forgetting a detail here, asking the same question twice there, letting a moment pass where I would normally have corrected someone, and I watched carefully as those moments were received, as Rebecca's responses shifted ever so slightly, as her confidence grew even stronger, because she believed what she was seeing confirmed her advantage, that I was becoming less aware, less attentive, less capable of noticing the details that had once defined my life, and I did not correct that assumption. I allowed it to settle, to become part of her understanding, because the more certain she became, the less careful she would need to be, and that was when the truth would become impossible for her to hide. And one evening, as we sat at the table once again, I asked a simple question, something about an account, something I already knew the answer to, and I watched as she responded quickly, confidently, offering an explanation that fit the version of reality she believed I still accepted, and Daniel nodded, satisfied, unaware of the difference between what was said and what was true, and I smiled softly, the same way I always had, because in that moment I understood that everything was moving exactly as it needed to, that the pattern she had created was now clear, not just to me but soon to anyone who would need to see it. And as I cleared the dishes that night, moving through the familiar motions of a life that outwardly had not changed, I felt a quiet sense of control settle into place, not because the situation was resolved, but because I was no longer reacting to it. I was guiding it, step by step, toward a moment that would not require raised voices or confrontation, but would speak for itself with a clarity that could not be ignored. By the time everything was in place, it no longer felt like I was waiting for the right moment. It felt like the moment had already arrived and was simply unfolding at its own pace. And I remember the morning clearly, not because anything dramatic happened, but because everything felt unusually calm, the kind of calm that comes when you know exactly what you are about to do and why. And I had already spoken with Mr. Harrison again the day before, confirming that all the documentation had been reviewed, that every transfer had been traced, that every authorization had been clearly outlined, and more importantly, that there was now a formal record of everything that had taken place, something that did not rely on memory or interpretation, but existed in precise, verifiable detail. And that was what mattered, because I had no intention of arguing or explaining. I intended to show. And that afternoon, I invited Daniel and Rebecca over for dinner, the same way I had done so many times before, the same table, the same dishes, the same quiet routine that had always made them feel comfortable. And when they arrived, nothing seemed different. Daniel greeted me with his usual warmth, Rebecca with her composed smile, and I welcomed them in without hesitation, moving through the motions as naturally as I always had, because that familiarity was part of what made everything that followed so clear. And as we sat down to eat, the conversation stayed light, simple, almost routine, and I allowed it to continue that way for a while, because there was no need to rush, no need to interrupt what they believed was a normal evening. And then, at a moment that felt entirely ordinary, I placed a folder on the table, not abruptly, not dramatically, but gently, as if it were just another item among many, and I said, in the same calm tone I had used throughout the evening, that I had been reviewing my accounts and had come across something I wanted to clarify. And Daniel looked at me with mild curiosity, while Rebecca's expression remained composed, though I noticed the smallest shift in her posture, the slight stillness that I had come to recognize. And I opened the folder, turning it toward them, revealing not a single document, but a sequence, organized, dated, aligned in a way that required no explanation, and for a moment, neither of them spoke because the information spoke first, the transfers, the authorizations, the linked accounts, all presented clearly, without accusation, without commentary, and I watched as Daniel leaned forward, his brow furrowing as he began to read, his eyes moving from one page to the next, and I saw the confusion return, not as uncertainty this time, but as realization, slow and undeniable, and Rebecca remained quiet, her gaze fixed on the documents, her expression controlled, but no longer as effortless as before, and I did not fill the silence, I did not guide the conversation, I allowed them to reach the understanding on their own, because that understanding would carry more weight than anything I could say, and after a few moments Daniel looked up, his voice quieter now, asking how this could have happened, and I met his eyes steadily, not with anger, not with accusation but with clarity, and I told him that the record showed exactly what had happened, that the payments he believed he had been sending had indeed been made, but they had not come to me, and I let that settle because it needed to, and then I turned my attention to Rebecca, not sharply, not confrontationally, but directly, and I asked a simple question, whether she recognized the account listed in the documents, and for the first time since I had known her, she did not answer immediately, and that pause, that small, unguarded moment said more than any explanation could have, and I did not press further, because I did not need to, the evidence was already there, complete and undeniable. And as the silence stretched across the table, I understood that everything I had prepared, every detail I had reviewed, every step I had taken quietly and carefully, had led to this moment, not a confrontation, not a conflict, but a revelation that required no raised voices, no argument, only the truth presented clearly enough that it could no longer be ignored. The silence at the table did not break all at once, it shifted slowly, like something settling into its final shape, and I watched as Daniel leaned back in his chair, his hands resting on the edge of the table as if he needed something steady to hold on to, his eyes moving again over the documents, searching for a different explanation, a detail that might change what he was beginning to understand, but there was none, and I could see it in the way his shoulders lowered slightly, the way his expression changed from confusion to something quieter, something heavier, and Rebecca remained still, her composure not gone, but no longer as effortless as it had been before. And for a long moment no one spoke because there was nothing left to clarify, nothing left to interpret, and I realized then that this was the moment I had been preparing for, not to argue, not to demand, but simply to stand in the truth without needing to raise my voice, and I folded my hands gently on the table, looking at both of them with the same calm expression I had carried through every step of this, and when Daniel finally spoke, his voice low, asking how long this had been happening, I did not answer immediately, not because I did not know, but because the answer was already in front of him in the dates, in the records, in the pattern that stretched across months and years, and he followed those details himself, his eyes tracing the timeline until the realization reached him fully, and when it did, he turned toward Rebecca, not with anger, but with a kind of quiet disbelief, as if he was seeing something he had never expected to see, and she finally spoke then, her voice measured, attempting to explain, to frame what had happened as something misunderstood, something necessary, something that could still be softened with the right words, but the words did not hold, not against what was already clear, and I listened without interrupting, because I understood that explanations often come when the truth can no longer be avoided, but they do not change what has already been done, and when she finished I did not respond with questions or accusations, I simply reached for another document in the folder and placed it gently on top of the others, one that outlined the steps already taken to reverse what had been done, to secure my accounts, to remove unauthorized access, to ensure that what belonged to me would no longer be moved without my knowledge, and I explained it calmly, not as a threat, not as a warning, but as a fact because that was all it needed to be, and Daniel looked at the document, then back at me, and I could see something shift in his expression, not just understanding but respect, because for the first time he was seeing not just what had happened, but how I had chosen to respond to it, and I stood then, slowly gathering the papers with the same care I had used to arrange them, because the conversation did not need to continue, the truth had already been said, and as I moved toward the kitchen, the familiar rhythm of my home surrounding me once again, I felt no need to fill the silence they left behind, no need to demand apologies or explanations, because what mattered had already been established, and later, after they had gone, after the door had closed and the house had returned to its quiet stillness, I sat at the table once more, looking at the space where the folder had been, And I thought about everything that had led to this moment, the small details, the overlooked signs, the quiet decisions that had allowed someone else to step into a place that had never belonged to them. And I realized that nothing had truly been lost, not my memory, not my awareness, only my attention had been redirected. And now it had returned, sharper than before, clearer than it had been in years, and I allowed myself a small, steady breath as I looked around the room that had always been mine, understanding it fully again. And I said softly, not to anyone else, but to the quiet certainty that had settled within me. They thought I was forgetting things, but I was only remembering everything at the right time.